off if I have anything fraught to say. I'm going to turn off just a sec. Let's do it.
I'm gonna see how much this echoes. All right, welcome everyone. Greetings to all armchair commanders, legionaries, and veterans of the Long War. Welcome to the library. Today we have a very special guest, bringing the power of scholarly, even heretical analysis to bear on the understudied phenomenon of miniature wargaming. Ian Williams is a PhD candidate at UNC Chapel Hill and has previously prior to pursuing his digital labor and other topics. His prospective dissertation is an examination of the material history of miniatures wargaming, both as a matter of political economy and how they are used to rhetorically imagine history. Today he'll be telling us a bit about his research, after which there will be time for Q&A. Please give him a warm welcome.
So, Mike good? Okay. So thank you all for being here today for what I hope is a riveting discussion on miniatures wargaming. My plan is to talk for about 45 minutes and then we'll have 15 minutes or longer. Larkin has assured me that there's no strict time limit for questions and discussions. So Larkin already gave my intro, but adding to that, I am a nearly lifelong miniatures wargamer. I started when I was 10 or 11 years old. Now, I came into my PhD program late in life after doing all of the things that Larkin detailed. And when you come into a PhD program, you're inclined to start off with big dreams of solving some sort of grand philosophical problem or finding the God particle in your living room. But you're quickly disabused of that notion because people who are way smarter than you had the same dreams, and it didn't work, and I was no different. I did know that I wanted to study craft, what it is and why do people do it. And one of the things I settled on was that the definitions we have of craft and non-craft aren't satisfactory. We think of craft in terms of technology, that craft is in various ways complicated than that. But I needed a discrete object to study, something which proves that these categories bleed into one another. So as it turns out, I had just such an object at hand. It was in my pile of shame. Miniatures wargaming, as it turns out, is one of those sectors where the lines between craft and industry are blurred. The truncated way miniatures are made goes something like this. A sculptor, a real art school type sculptor, makes a single statue, and you can see one on the left there in green. And then that statue is taken to a factory where a mold is made, and that statue is reproduced in the hundreds or in the thousands. They're shipped, they're put on shelves, they're sold, and these statues are then reconstituted as craft by the individual wargamer who buys it, glues it together, and paints it. It's a bit like alchemy. Now, all of this is, I want to stress, a rather strange thing to do. It's strange to be an artist and decide you want to make tiny statues. It's weird to make games with them, and it's weird to buy hundreds of them which pile up in your house while you paint maybe a quarter of them. I wanted to find out why people got into these. Luckily, it was relatively easy to figure out what the motivations are because miniatures design and production is heavily concentrated in and around Nottingham, UK, in an area colloquially called the Lead Belt, because most miniatures used to be made of lead alloys. There are dozens of studios, ranging from Games Workshop, who produce Warhammer. We're going to talk a lot about Warhammer. And they're a massive company. And then you have small 1- and 2-person studios selling made-to-order miniatures. So I went there for about 6 weeks, and I talked to people about why they did this. I embedded at 2 studios, Warlord and Mantic, and I spoke to everybody I could find for over a month. Almost all of those people are anonymous in my research for ethical reasons, except for a few. I spoke to Chris Peach at length, who is a YouTube painter, and Rick Priestley, the co-creator of Warhammer, for example. So before we go into a history of miniatures wargaming, I want to lay some groundwork for what they are and what people do with them. In academia, there's been a recent move to study analog games, that is games, more seriously. But miniatures wargames have been curiously omitted in the literature. The primary journal for analog game studies, which is appropriately called Analog Game Studies, delivers a call to action on this front in its first issue. The call to action mentions several board games by name, as well as more generally, various card games, Dungeons and Dragons, and indie role-playing games, but it makes no mention of the miniatures wargame. Curious thing, one of the driving forces in this shift in emphasis is the resurgent popularity of analog games. Dungeons and Dragons is held up as the main popular justification for us. It practically keeps Hasbro afloat through its ongoing record sales. But Warhammer, its counterpart as the bully on the block in miniatures wargaming, receives far less academic attention despite sales rivaling and perhaps exceeding D&D. And that's something we don't know for certain due to D&D's sales figures are sometimes lumped in with Magic the Actor. He makes a strong case for the Space Marine as the most popular statue in the entirety of human history, and the first one which we've painted since the days of the ancient Greeks. Despite this, miniatures wargaming is rather culturally sequestered as something desperately nerdy, in a way that other analog games even aren't. Henry Cavill, the actor, was famously made fun of for his obsession with Warhammer on the Graham Norton show. Games Workshop is desperate for this configuration of things to change, going so far as to launch its own streaming service with in-house produced animated series, but they've experienced limited success thus far. And because of this, miniatures wargaming is kind of hard to pin down. It has elements of traditional wargaming, board gaming, and role-playing, but it is its own thing. It's mathy, but it's also founded in historical wargaming and speculative fiction. It is all of those things and its own thing. So we need to come up with a definition of what a miniatures wargame is. So I promise I'm not going to do a whole, but this is pretty vernacular, and I think it's a great starting point, because the primary theorization of wargaming comes from Mikko Merilainen, who conducted a qualitative study of those who play miniatures wargaming with a team of other sociology researchers. And what they come up with is kind of a meta practice they term miniaturing. Miniaturing consists of 6 overlinking and overlapping practices to form kind of hobby. And miniaturing contains all of these to some extent or other based on the individual miniaturist, but the presence of all of them makes miniaturing distinct from other forms of analog play. And the first is gaming, right? And they're kind of careful to call it gaming rather than play for a bunch of reasons about trying to get away from kind of trans-historical meta definitions of play. And this is what you would expect, right? List building, actually playing the games, actual use of miniatures, and you can see a game underway here in this photo. The second is crafting. Unlike board game pieces, miniatures require at least some assembly. They come in pieces. At the very least, you're going to glue like a single piece of metal onto a plastic base. Also expected that you will paint your miniatures as they come unpainted, and otherwise they look like indistinct lumps of plastic or metal on the table. And often these miniatures are customized. People chop them up. New bits are added. Some are taken away or they're reposed. The third is collecting. Colloquially known as the pile of shame, miniaturists are notorious for buying way more miniatures than they actually need. This isn't just rare or out-of-print miniatures, although some people do collect those. Rather, it's that players usually collect numerous armies, and it's important to stress that these are armies rather than individual figures, which need to be assembled and painted, creating a constantly escalating cycle of acquisition. You just buy and collect more than you're ever going to finish. Miniaturists, and you can tell by the laughter in the front row, they find this very funny. And they don't at all bristle when they're confronted with their piles of shame. Nope. Fourth is storytelling. Miniaturists tell stories with and about their miniatures. This can be a scenario for a particular military action with its own story, but it can also be telling the story of a particular favorite miniature. This can be done with the painting and posing of miniatures as well as in verbal or written form. Excuse me. It also often coalesces after something happens in play, where a crucial die roll goes well or poorly to then be explained in fictive form after the fact. How, for instance, do we know the miniatures in this photo are veterans? Do we buy them as veterans and narrate accordingly? Or do they become veterans narratively through play? And what even is a veteran? What does that mean? Those are the sort of narrative questions which arise within miniaturing. Lastly, or fifthly rather, is displaying. This boils down to it not being much use to lavishly paint these tiny statues without showing them off. We all want to show them off. Display cases arranged in their armies, they take pictures. With the advent of social media and streaming platforms, and this also points to kind of that porousness of a analog divide, photos are circulated and admired. There's a thriving culture of painting, most notably Duncan Rhodes, who is our very own nerdy Bob Ross, half crafting tutorials and half just watching the results of what an expert painter can do. Lastly is socializing, and this is exactly what it sounds like. Miniaturists get together to talk about miniatures. In fact, this talk right here is the socialization aspect in practice. You're listening to me talk. Some of you know each other and had lunch before you came here, and you probably talk about miniatures. A couple of you will talk more after, and someone might catch me after the talk is over and talk to me about it. We like to talk about miniatures a lot. So this is the important bit. All of these practices are variable. There are miniaturists who just paint with them, some just collect, some want to socialize around YouTube videos, watch lore videos, and so forth. And this is important because it's a key part of the culture of miniatures wargaming. Miniatures who rarely or don't, who just likes to display his miniatures. That's the thing that he's really He's extremely enthusiastic about it. So there's this tension there, which is always being negotiated whenever you're interacting with your miniaturists. Who are these miniatures for? What do we do with them? And where are the resources allocated? So I'm presuming that most of you are familiar with miniatures wargames, but I also want to allow some space for those who don't know what they are and signed up for what looked like a cool talk without knowing the context. For the purposes of this talk, let's set up the following working definition of what a miniatures wargame is, which is tightly related to, but not quite the same thing as miniaturing. A miniature wargame is a game played on a table with arrangeable terrain with mini miniatures, which has some sort of competitive aspect to it, in which you do not portray a single individual but a force of soldiers, in which models combat conditions rather than the heroic actions of an individual. People buy tiny statues or miniatures and paint them up, then arrange them in mock battles. You roll dice to see if attacks are successful. Some miniatures die, and there's a winner. The easiest place to start is, of course, Warhammer, which an awful lot of people have heard of, even if they're not familiar with miniatures wargames. They're market leaders with an almost monopolistic hold on the miniatures wargaming landscape. Warhammer and Dungeons & Dragons also share lineage, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And they both, weirdly, have almost exactly the same yearly revenues. They're both very involved in brand identification, which goes back to that kind of synonymous with its respective sphere kind of thing I said. And when I try to explain why I decided to devote 6 years and counting of my life to thinking very hard about miniatures wargames, people will say, oh, like Warhammer. And I go, yeah, like Warhammer. Now, for those who don't know what Warhammer is, like I said, it's the biggest wargame in the world, and it's partly or even largely responsible for what's popularly known as the grimdark aesthetic. There are two main game lines, Warhammer Fantasy Battle and Warhammer 40,000, or there were, they killed off Fantasy, but Warhammer 40,000, or 40K as it's colloquially known, is ridiculously popular. I'll talk very briefly about the death of Warhammer Fantasy Battle later. They're mixes of influences. One is fantasy and one is sci-fi, and they're born out of what seemed like a crumbling Britain of the 1970s and early 1980s. Warhammer is satirical, and it's made up of shades of gray, though that has been toned down over the years. But in those early days, and lingering now, they're games about a distrust of authority and runaway technology, where orcs are based on football hooligans and humanity teeters on the edge of damnation. I'll talk a little bit more later about its appeal, but it's an obvious touchstone. People play it all over the world and have for 40 plus years, and it's a mark of its resiliency and appeal that it's lasted that long. But miniatures wargaming is a lot more than just Warhammer. There are other sci-fi and fantasy games. There are historical games. There are hybrids. There are different scales to play at. There are mass battle games and skirmish games. In other words, despite Games Workshop's efforts to become synonymous with miniatures wargaming, there's a rich living history and tradition of miniatures wargaming which goes back centuries, and Warhammer is just a part of it. And that's what I'm going to talk about from here. On the left, you'll see some medieval toy figurines, and on the right, more Space Marines, this time painted a vibrant yellow. So how do we get from this on the left to this on the right? And what's common between them, even as we recognize that they're quite different? And where might miniatures wargaming go in the future? So I want to put forth the argument that miniatures wargaming has been around for as long as war has been around. That is, it's been around forever. Toy soldiers and castles have been found in archaeological digs dating back to the 1300s in Europe and are portrayed in art from the time. This catapult on the right of the slide is from ancient Egypt. Now, if you have kids, you know that they look to emulate what adults are doing around them, and we, for our part, tend to corral them into notions of proper play. We teach them rules and behaviors. So imagine you're the son of a baron in 14th century France, and it was a baron because there's a bit of gentility being taught here. Your dad didn't give you those toys across the river or feast with them, although you might have done that as well. You had those toys in order to play war. Your soldiers fought your brother's soldiers, and you argued about how this or that soldier killed that one or didn't, and eventually you made up rules to determine what was happening. Suddenly you have something which looks very much like a miniatures war game. There were codified games too. Fudging our definition of what a miniatures war game is a bit, chess and Go are forerunners of miniatures wargaming. These are tactical games in which you move representations of soldiers on the board. I know they look like little horses and little beads, but they do represent and behave as soldiers. They were explicitly made to teach young men and boys the tactical knowledge necessary for being a warrior. And I think this is an important thing to hold in your mind, as it's contradictory. These are games, they're fun. And that's how we play them today. And are also teaching tools. They taught a certain way of thinking about the world and about space. This was directly applicable on the battlefield, and it prepared you for war. Things continued in this vein for hundreds of years. Wars was meant to be a light alternative to the drab complexity of games like Kriegspiel. It was billed as, quote, a game for boys from 12 years of age to 150, and for that more intelligent sort of girl who likes boys' games and books. If you're hearing the echoes of that gender essentialism from the Middle Ages, however ironically it's being presented, you have good ears for the obvious. Wells was an ardent and lifelong pacifist, so it's maybe odd that he wrote a war game, but he didn't find it a contradictory thing to do, as this quote right here illustrates. I'm not going to read it out loud because I can't see from my angle, but I think it's even a moving quote. But in this quote, he recognizes that there's something fun about simulated violence, even as real violence is awful. So the contradiction is one that he admits. How can you think war is awful and make a game of war? He lived with that contradiction and basically said, look, maybe these impulses can be shrunk down to the size of toy soldiers and a table or a backyard, and maybe that defines war or funnels those impulses into something more social and constructive than picking up real guns and real books, real bullets, rather. It's the commercial aspect, I think, that is most important for the purposes of this talk, rather than Wells's philosophy. Little Wars was explicitly commercial, right? So now the war game itself was commercial, and it shifted to something closer to miniatures and three-dimensional terrain, which we're familiar with today when we go to stores and play our homes. You played it with the toy soldiers you bought at your local shop. You arranged terrain in a given space. And taken together, these were real shifts from the Kriegspiel model. Things continued in this vein. It was in the UK that miniatures wargames really flourished as a mass cultural thing for the first time. This is one of the things that intrigued me. Miniatures wargaming is now a global industry, but it's also an intensely British phenomenon. There's the simple lineage of it at play. Warhammer traces a line back through the rules people made for their air-fixed planes in the 1950s and 60s, and then to Wells, back to Napoleon, and the lead belgas, of course, in England. But why, for instance, do analog gamers there start with miniatures wargames, when here in the US, when we get into them, we start more often with Dungeons and Dragons or get really into board games? And this is one of the consistent questions I ask my participants. Why miniatures wargaming when you could do a host of other things? And I got some very consistent answers. Everyone I spoke to who was old enough to remember the 1970s or had grandparents who fought in World War II, so everyone from about their 40s on up, spoke about how British media was saturated for decades with World War II stories. Everything from comic books to television to movies to fashion to radio, everywhere. And everybody told me this. This quote, and I won't read it in its entirety, is from one of my participants, a game designer. What he describes here is a national reckoning with the way that the British won World War II, but also lost their empire. And this is a contradictory thing. How can you win, but also still lose? So media at the time was a way of grappling with this contradiction, what Paul Gilroy calls post-colonial melancholia. And the participant really articulated the complexities around this, right? He followed this by talking about how the empire was wrong in most of what it did, and how media and miniatures were a way of grappling with this kind of societal sadness. And I said to him, you have a pretty nuanced view of that legacy, so why do you do miniatures, knowing this legacy, this history? And he smiled a little to me, and he said, I guess I'm a bit sad too. So a brief interlude. So far we've talked about historical wargaming. The most popular in the 21st century are what I call speculative games, so they're sci-fi or fantasy. And there's an interesting feedback loop there, which starts with Dungeons and Dragons. The story of D&D is fairly well known, so I won't dwell too much on it. But briefly, the creators of D&D, led by Gary Gygax, were miniatures wargamers. And one day Gygax got his friends together and said, hey, what if instead of playing armies, we each played one guy? And that guy leveled up, got better, founded a kingdom, and we had a group of guys, and we told collective stories about our heroes. Now, important for this story in its early D&D in its early editions was a miniatures game, although it was distinctly not a war game in the sense we know them now due to that shift in scope and emphasis. It was presumed that you played early editions of D&D with miniatures. A lot of people still do that today, but it and role-playing games more generally have evolved to a theater of the mind style of game, where you imagine the action rather than use miniatures. And D&D is, of course, immensely popular and was immediately immensely popular. That popularity and the shift from historical to speculative entailed is part of Games Workshop's origin story. The story runs very briefly as follows. Games Workshop starts as a small board game store in London, which gets in bed with a disgruntled genius named Brian Ansel, who just recently and tragically passed away. Ansel was interested in selling miniatures, and Games Workshop strikes up a distribution deal for D&D in the UK. Ansel, as part of this, casts his own miniatures, and then it slowly dawns on him that they could make a lot more money by breaking away from D&D entirely and coming up with their own rules for their miniatures. And that's how Warhammer's born. Now we're going to talk about Warhammer because, and I'm quoting my co-author and friend Sam Tobin here, talking about wargaming without talking about Games Workshop is like talking about animation without talking about Disney. And that picture on the bottom is my brother and I in 1996 at the Games Workshop store in Exeter, thus proving that it is more or less a lifelong obsession. And that was a magical summer where we just hung out with the assistant manager of the store, a guy named Dan. So, how did this small shop in London become a global corporation and near monopoly with the best performing stock on the London Stock Exchange? That's a really long and complicated story, but the briefest answer is that Ansel was a ruthless businessman and brilliant miniatures producer. And it's tied up in a weird way with D&D's success in British politics. So So when I spoke to Rick Priestley, he told me that everyone wanted to play D&D in the 70s, but it was tough to get hold of, primarily due to post-war capital controls in Britain. So if you were lucky, maybe one person might have a copy of D&D in your circles in the 70s. So when he and his co-author and childhood friend Richard Hallowell sat down to write rules, both before and during the first edition of Warhammer, that's the problem they were navigating. How could they tap into the D&D zeitgeist and their own desire to play it when it was hard to get D&D? There was the distribution model with Games Workshop, but that had limited efficacy, so they turned to a distinctly British form of storytelling and gaming, which was miniatures wargames. There was a recent YouTube interview with Priestley and fellow longtime designer Jervis Johnson, came out last week, which had an interesting tidbit. They let slip that when they were designing Necromunda, which is a mid-90s skirmish game set in the 40K universe, they didn't really understand why people were amazed at the role-playing aspect of it, because the Wild West war games they played in the 70s had a heavy element of role-playing to them, and that was before D&D ever hit British shores. So there's this entwined history for the two forms, but this also gets to Warhammer's Britishness, which I think is a core part of its success. My first foray into miniaturing was getting a white dwarf in the mail from my mother. She was an expat living in England. She knew my brother and I were into D&D, but she didn't really know what that was, and she was far away from us, so she sent us the thing that looked like D&D to her, which was a white dwarf. And I remember being a kid, opening it and reading the battle reports and looking at the miniatures, and it was so different from anything that I was familiar with. And that got its hooks into me, and I imagine that that's a familiar feeling for a lot of people who picked up Warhammer at some point in their lives. So I want to flag 5 events in Games Workshop's journey to where they are now, and these do have to do with the culture and the way they produce rules and miniatures. So the first is Games Workshop goes public in 1994. Games Workshop's success compounded over the course of the 80s with Brian Ansel at the helm, and a man named Tom Kirby, who was in management there, led a management buyout in 1991, and they went public soon after. This was a big shift as Games Workshop began to concentrate on sales volume and expanding its footprint outside of the UK. Second is the release of Gorka Morka in 1997. Gorka Morka was a game where you played orcs on a desert planet, sort of 40K meets Mad Max. It's a really cool game, but its origin is tied up in tensions between the design studio and marketing. Marketing wanted a Christmas game out on a tight turnaround, and the design studio, as they usually did, was trusted to get the job done. Only this time, they only had 8 weeks to get it done. So marketing, for its part, overproduced the game, which had mediocre sales, and the design studio was blamed. From there, per Rick Priestley, Games Workshop moved from a designer-led studio to a marketing-led one, with a very different ethos. Third is the acquisition of the Lord of the Rings license in 2001. The Lord of the Rings films had just come out, and if anybody was alive then, you know they were absolutely massive. So Games Workshop's game, which is quite good, plugged into that energy. Sales spiked. They opened new stores in conjunction in the US with the Mills Mall chain of mega malls, which has a huge overhead and would come to cause some problems with them later. And everything was good until it wasn't. It was basically a bubble, as anybody who could tell you it would be, except for at Games Workshop, because the popularity of the movies was bound to fade over the years. So Games Workshop subsequently has some real doldrums on the stock market and in revenues at the time. Their response to this slump and the fourth event is Games Workshop's reinvention of itself as a trademark troll. The response to the post-Lord of the Rings decline was to express increasing hostility to everyone from other sculptors cribbing from Warhammer aesthetics, to fan-made websites, to people using the word Space Marines in their novels, even though that term predates Games Workshop's founding and which they certainly didn't invent. This all reached a head when Games Workshop sued a small company called Chapter House. So I'm not going to give you a full accounting of a hundreds-page lawsuit, but the short version is that Chapter House specialized in making small sculpts to customize your miniatures, so like shoulder pads for your Space Marines, and miniatures in a Games Workshop style, but that which Games Workshop had never bothered to make miniatures for. So Games Workshop mostly, not entirely, but mostly loses this case because, as it turns out, arguing in front of an American judge that you can trademark the Iron Cross and a particular angle of curvature of a Space Marine shoulder pad does not pass legal muster. Chapter House was nonetheless bankrupted, but this opened the door for a wider range of fan and amateur-made material based on or compatible with Warhammer. Games Workshop's response was to make fewer miniatures, or basically to only write rules for units they already had miniatures for, and to shift to more straightforwardly trademarkable material in their games. And this last bit, as I mentioned about the death of Warhammer, this is why they pulled the plug, because it was Tolkien-esque and hard to trademark, and they created a different fantasy game called Age of Sigmar. Lastly was COVID. Just like with D&D, sales reached new heights during COVID for Games Workshop. People looked for things to occupy their time during lockdown and at home. This really helped rescue Games Workshop from the trap it was in post-Lord of the Rings and post-Chapter House. There were real discussions. I remember having real discussions with people about whether Games Workshop would survive the 2010s at points, as the Kirby leadership was failing. They were a troubled company. And the new boom is still ongoing, and only time will tell whether it's another extended bubble. It probably is. So I want to return to why Warhammer is appealing. At its core, the Warhammer games are satire. It was originally created by a bunch of working class people distrustful of authority, religion, and technology, and all of that shows in the game. They were metalheads, ex-hippies, and punk rockers, and what comes across in Warhammer is part of the spirit of the late 70s and early 80s. DIY, arising in a time of labor strife, a death of empire, and huge shifts in British politics. The worlds of Warhammer and Warhammer 40,000 are grimdark places where you think you have to pray to your gun in order to get it to work. Humanity is caught in the bind that it can only survive amongst the stars by selling its soul to fascism, and super soldiers are regarded as angels. There's political content here, obviously. And if you've spent any time in wargaming discourse, you'll know that there's a constant tug of war over whose politics are represented in Warhammer. Is the fascism good? Is it a send-up and a warning based on current day conditions? So when I spoke to Priestley, I asked him the political question directly, and I was a bit surprised because he seemed really surprised that somebody would ask it. Here's what he said. In the early days of Games Workshop, he wasn't terribly politically active, and Richard Hallowell was a left-winger, and Brian Ansell was an anarchist. Everybody called Brian Ansell an anarchist that I spoke to and laughed about. They were, in effect, pulling from everywhere they could and commenting, wittingly or not, on everything they saw. There's a very smart man over at Duke named Frederick Jameson, and I'm not going to do a Jameson lecture in 30 seconds for you. But what he says, in really simple, distilled, possibly incorrect terms, is that we have experienced a loss of connection to history and settled meanings over the past 40 to 50 years. And once this happened, symbols and signs can be used for any purpose. Their meaning is floating. This is what allows us to remake movies over and over. Or, more optimistically and more productively, we can use samples and songs. But also, we don't really do this intentionally. It's just how we are. And this is how you can end up with this ambiguity around Warhammer and its meaning on the part of designers, and how we can argue for so long about what it means. But also, I want to stress, I don't mean that as some sort of pointed criticism of Warhammer. I think its popularity is in reconfiguring older symbols, characters, and motifs into this thing which can mean many things. One of the dirty secrets of Warhammer, and it's ironic because Games Workshop did become such notorious IP hounds, is that there's very little which is original in it. It pulls from Dune in 2000 AD, the work of Michael Moorcock, Judge Dredd, World War II films, Star Wars, Tolkien, and others. And once those things are reconfigured in Warhammer, brought onto the tabletop, we make sense of them based on what's around us and with a recognition toward what was around the designers who wrote it. It has mass appeal because it taps into this sense that was present in the 70s and 80s and has lingered that something is wrong. And we've all agreed that something is wrong for quite a long time, even if we can't agree what that wrongness is. So what are some trends in Warhammer, or miniatures wargaming more generally? I even did it, I called miniatures wargaming wargaming. The culture of miniatures wargaming evolved into two primary modes of gaming, competitive and narrative. So we use Marilyn's rubric of miniaturing. This shouldn't be surprising, as some miniaturists are more interested in storytelling than others. But the rules of various wargames reflect those interests. A tournament player, for instance, is going to be chasing a meta for effectiveness. Some even cycle through armies at a rapid pace, chasing that meta, but buy one and then they'll sell one almost immediately. Something which the narrative wargamers tend to be loath to do as they get attached to their armies and figures. So this is a tension in miniaturing culture. A common linguistic tick, which always confused me, comes up when you schedule a pickup game with someone. You hop on Facebook, you look for a local to play with, and they say a variation of, do you want to play competitively or do you want to play for fun? Now, the full implication is that a competitive game is not fun, which is a very strange thing to pursue in the hobby. They don't mean it this way, but I do think it gets to that tension. Now, most games, most non-Games Workshop games, are made with an eye towards either competitive or narrative play, one or the other. But Games Workshop, as the overwhelmingly #1 studio, has a solution to this kind of tension. They write their games for both, or attempt to, with slightly different rules for each, supplements which can only be used in one or the other, and even miniatures which can't be used in competitive play. In actual practice, it's a bad solution. There's a commonplace, which is that Games Workshop makes great miniatures but bad games. And while it wouldn't go that far, it does sometimes create a mess which other games avoid by just picking one or the other and focusing on it. This is often parsed as bad design on the part of Games Workshop, but let's return to those 5 events I mentioned before. To a very real extent, Games Workshop can't make games other than the ones that they make because of the economic underpinnings of their current situation. They answer to stockholders, not miniaturists. On the topic of competitive versus narrative play, they have to cater to both in order to maximize sales, and there's an argument that they end up satisfying neither, although I'm quite certain that Games Workshop thinks that it's working just fine. But because of their dominance, what everybody who is dissatisfied with Warhammer does is mostly sits around and complains about Warhammer. Another trend is the shift to store play, at least here in North America. This is one of those cultural differences which slightly freaked people out when I spoke to them in the UK. We play in stores here, and while there's certainly store play in the UK and the rest of Europe, there's also an alternative tradition which informs miniature wargaming there. The Gaming Club. These are full-on civic societies which have elections, pay dues, rent out a space for regular meetings. They sometimes even do charity work. It's an entirely different mode of engagement with miniaturing. Think of your surroundings in a store. Now, I don't know about anyone else, but I doubt I'm alone. When I walk into a store to play a game, and I don't feel anything, and I don't buy anything, I feel bad. Right? I feel like I should walk out since they just basically rented me some store space for a couple hours. Right? And this is not a terrible thing, but everything in a store is to push commerce. That's what a store is. So this creates a certain set of conditions and expectations around how you socialize at a store, even if you walk out without buying anything. The club is different, imperfect, because everything is, but it's more democratic, a bit more like casual hanging out with friends. Home play has, in correlation with the rise of store play, largely disappeared. When I was a kid, you played at someone's house. Now, when I suggest this as a first option for a game, I tend to get weird looks. Do you want to go to my house? I don't want to go to my house. I don't really want to go to yours. So I had this theory, right? That it had something to do with declining home ownership rates, or maybe like homes had less square footage, but engaging with that kind of idea was a full quantitative dissertation on its own, and I am functionally enumerate. But I do think that there's something to that. There's been this recent move to make games with a smaller physical footprint for your kitchen tables, right, as a way of juicing this, like bringing it back 3x3 or 4x4 feet in play area. And I had a really illuminating conversation with an ex-Games Workshop employee who was privy to some discussions at the company. Because I mentioned offhand that I found Games Workshop's recent move, they changed their play areas, right? It used to be 6x4 or 8x4 in the old days. It was very consistently 6x4. And starting with 8th edition, maybe 9th, they moved to 44 inches by 30 inches, 44 by 60, which is a really strange size. So I said, this is weird. Why would they do that? And he said the answer was simple, and I was there for the talks. Those were the most common table sizes sold by IKEA. Now I bring this up because I think it's important when we talk about culture, any culture, we attend to the kind of materiality of our surroundings and circumstances. A game design decision, it is a game design decision to shrink those tables down, but it's driven here by raw economics, while club versus store versus home influence our social relations play. So what does the future of miniatures wargaming look like? To some extent, it looks like it does now, with Games Workshop dominating in a much smaller but thriving set of other speculative games than historical. But technologically, things are changing. 3D printing has revolutionized the hobby, not least because the Chapter House lawsuit means that Games Workshop can't trademark everything about their aesthetics. And I do, though, however, have to admit that I think it's weird that in the world of 3D printing where anyone can make anything, everybody just tends to make more Games Workshop. Platforms like YouTube offer a new vector for professional painting instruction and showing off your cool battle reports, albeit one that provides only a precarious existence. Now, Games Workshop doesn't sound like a very nice place to work. And the nature of the industry is that it works a bit in reverse to the digital games industry. In digital games, most often you start out at a small game studio or making your own game. You work your way up to progressively larger studios. In the lead belt, you work at Games Workshop first. It's underpaid work given the size of the company and its revenues, and Games Workshop management is notoriously difficult to get along with. So you burn out, you quit, and you move to a smaller studio or you open your own. Out of the 26 people I interviewed, 69% had worked at Games Workshop. None of them had good things to say about the work culture there. So all were complimentary about the actual stuff in Warhammer, the actual stuff that Games Workshop makes. They were much happier working smaller and working smaller studios and with more creative freedom. To bring this back to my craft interest, Games Workshop crafts wrong, and the skills people learned there allow them to do things in what they see is the right way. And Games Workshop's loss is our gain. There's a thriving scene of small and independent wargames out there. Those same technological affordances and advances which allow for 3D printing allow for broader rules and miniatures distribution by a PDF. There are lots of cool games made by this thriving scene of ex or never were Games Workshop designers. You can hop on YouTube and watch painting videos or dramatizations of the lore. You don't have to play Warhammer. Now, I do, I'm wearing a white dwarf shirt. Right? I like Warhammer quite a lot, even with all of its strange and sometimes unfortunate practices. But I don't just play Games Workshop games, and I'm glad I do. So I want to close Same here. I want to close here by asking the ever-important question, who cares? I take deeply to heart, I'm going to slip just ever so slightly into a little academic piece, but not too much. I take deeply to heart the charge of what I do, which is cultural studies, and that is that culture in all forms, no matter how everyday, is worthy of study. The normal and everyday is how we live. Quote Raymond Williams, I don't believe that the ordinary people, in fact, resemble the normal description of the masses, low and trivial in taste and habit. Or perhaps it is that miniatures wargaming is both silly and kind of weird, but also that there is meaning in it. There must be, because people play it. We are complex and complicated creatures. Our hobbies are too. More than once in this presentation I used the words contradiction or tension. And contradictions and tension lie at the heart of miniatures wargaming. Amateur and professional, craft and industry, competition and storytelling, corporate and non-corporate, war and peace, fun and serious, and that's okay. It's all of those things, and whatever it is at a given moment is under constant negotiation, at the table or otherwise. It's interesting. Lastly, miniatures wargaming, and especially Warhammer, are popular, and they're going to get more popular. Amazon is optioning a series based on Warhammer 40K, and Henry Cavill, who is pushing to star in the big budget production, is poised to have the last laugh on whether he's a big nerd or not. Popularity matters here, not because we academics must fear for our relevancy, but because cultural forms matter. As such, miniatures wargaming matters. Miniatures wargaming is having a moment, but it's just one moment among many over 1,000 years. It's a cool hobby, a bit all-consuming, admittedly, and sometimes a bit fraught, but it's cool nonetheless. And in spite of what people might tell you, I was worried coming into this, and I still am a bit, if I'm being honest, that a cultural history of miniatures wargaming is just too much for 45 minutes. It's too big, too rich, and it's too odd to do justice to. There's so much to talk about here that no brief survey of miniaturing can do it all justice. So I hope I did a reasonable job in 45-ish minutes, and I'm now going to open the floor to questions and comments. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so your last bullet point is a conjecture that it's going to be more popular to wargame. I was wondering if you could comment on that in the face of growing economic hardship. Because I think of Warhammer, and everybody in the room can probably agree here, it's expensive. And it's kind of a luxury consumption good. And in a world where everybody's budgets are getting tighter, what impact do you think that's going to have on the hobby?
I think for those core people who are like super invested in Warhammer, that they have a certain amount of like disposable income anyway, right? There's this kind of thing where like by the time you have time to like you have a lot of time to play it when you're a kid, but you can't afford it, and then by the time you can afford it, you don't have time. I think the answer is that people play non-Games Workshop games, right? Like I've seen more people do that even as Warhammer is thriving, and I think people will 3D print pirates a lot more, right? I didn't talk about this, but there is a big scene concentrated in China and Russia and Poland to a lesser extent called recasting, where people will buy the miniatures, like particularly the high-end resin miniatures from Games Workshop, and they'll make a mold and then they'll cut it. They'll produce them, and they're produced in factories. I actually spoke secondhand with a recaster for translation issues. And like they're just workers like everybody else, and they're poised to make a lot more money, right? If you know where to look, right? But also for ethical reasons, because they're very secretive, right? They have a lot to lose, and it's not my job to like out them or anything like that. I'm neutral on that. But if you know where to look and you go there, you can see a burgeoning popularity, right? So I think that like people it's going to become more popular because analog games are getting more popular. But that doesn't necessarily mean that Warhammer is going to be, turning over like 30% increases in the profits or whatever year on year. This is the kind of negotiation that I was talking about.
Yeah, we're gonna roll it.
Okay.
Do you think that part of 40K specifically, its popularity is because it is not inherently a sci-fi genre, but rather it is science fantasy? And then follow-up question, was Cal self-defense?
I'll start with your follow-up. It was self-defense. Because I played word games.
Allegedly.
Return to your first question.
Yeah.
Repeat the first question.
Basically, you think 40K is
yeah.
so popular because it's not sci-fi, rather it's science fantasy?
I think that's a large part of it, right? Because one of the arguments in the ongoing debates about whether or not you're a Star Wars person or a Star Trek person is that like Star Wars is not sci-fi, and Star Wars is the more popular of them, right? Sorry, I'm on the Trek side, but it's true, and it is more popular because it's kind of blending that fantasy and sci-fi genre. Dune is like another example where which not by accident 40K cribs from.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think there's a lot to that, right? And like the iconography, right? We could dwell on kind of like the religion and the kind of lampooning and kind of like fear of religious iconography that's in Warhammer 40,000, right? But I think that that's something that everybody can relate to, particularly Catholics, particularly if you're in like continental Europe, where like you see cathedrals and things like that everywhere, right? So yeah, I do think that kind of blend is what spikes the appeal. I think it's immediately recognizable.
Yeah.
Right.
Thank you.
So you talked a little bit about Games Workshop specifically getting into sort of digital media production and Warhammer Plus. It is my entirely subjective opinion that what they have produced is not as good as the people they sued out of existence to build that edifice. Is that saying something about our media culture, or is that just Games Workshop not being good at what they decided to take over?
So I think that it's really important to understand the importance of control of IP and brands in modern corporations. And you think that seems like super obvious, right? Games Workshop, I think, and this goes for any, if you go for Disney, if you go for any number of media corporations, you're less interested in the quality than having control of that ecosystem, right? I don't think that Games Workshop, I'm quite certain that Games Workshop would rather their animated series be good. I don't think that anybody goes out there, if you're particularly worker, it has to be like demoralizing, right? Like if you're like an animator or whatever. But they're also not in control, right? Like functionally, it's just Games Workshop wants to crank that stuff out in order to keep the ecosystem close. I use this example, right? It is not related to these kind of like transmedia properties, like I'm going to like make a movie or something like that. This is actually like really interesting. Do you remember? Does anybody remember like back in first edition Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader? Does anybody remember how the Bad Ab War, which is a big deal in horror, was presented? It was just a sidebar, right? It was just a little thing. It was like 3 lines. It was like, hey, here's this planet Bad Ab, and there was a war there, right? And it was meant as a prompt for you to do your own thing with your miniatures at the table. Fast forward 20, 25 years, and they have entire books about it, right? This is like part of this enclosure, I think, of like, you are always going to play your own miniatures and stuff like that, right? But there's a predictability which leads to profits, right? Whenever these things are kind of like enclosed and like you can kind of predict and like you're playing in this kind of walled garden. So it's all about that, They want it to be good, but like in the absence, they'd rather have it be big.
2 things. First, a comment. Really appreciated the definition of miniaturing. Sure, a lot of time
Can I
and effort
interrupt
went
just
into
for a second? After his question, can somebody other than the first row ask a question? Thank you.
You heard the man.
So first, appreciate the definition of miniaturing. Thought that was really well thought out and actually a lot of food for thought. Second, you mentioned several times during the talk about the kind of male focus and I think very patriarchal nature of war games. Again, that's the history and the roots of it. But we've seen a lot of painful transitions with other forms of entertainment like this, of being more inclusive. And not just GW, but when I look across the spectrum, it's still very dated, right? It's still very male dominated, still very patriarchal. How do you think that's going to change over time? Does that create a barrier to popularity because of the roots of that? Like, what happens there?
So the best figures that we have, Wargaming Illustrated does a pretty large survey every year of like who plays what and who they are and stuff like that. The best data we have is that between 1.5 and 3% of miniatures wargamers are women, which is, I do not care what your political outlook is or anything like that. That is embarrassing, right? It is not like that in any other analog game scene. It's not like that in any digital game scene. It will change, right? And I think, and this is to Games Workshop's credit, like they've already started hiring more women, both like painting on screen and behind the scenes. Like the inclusion thing matters, right? So I think it will change. I think that wargaming is in a deeper hole than a lot of those other things because it has been hostile for so long, right? And the other thing is that like it plugs into a constellation of other stuff, right? Where like this is how we're socialized, right? For the guys in the audience, right? How many had like toy guns, right? Or played cops and robbers and stuff like that, right? So like we're socialized to do this, and then this just kind of like carries on. So it's not so much like strictly a wargaming problem. It's that like women are never like socialized to be welcome in that style of play or anything like that, right? So it's a much broader societal problem. But wargaming can do a lot better. It can be like just to be blunt, like wargamers can be less weird when a woman walks into the shop. Every woman wargamer has that story about walking into the Games Workshop store and having every head turn and like that's not gonna stop.
I know to narrow the focus was primarily on Games Workshop. Has any of your research looked at particularly at like the future with historical gaming? I know a lot of the Rick Fritzley and all of them have moved over to Warlord, and some of the other companies, Osprey, starting to do a lot more with historical gaming with miniatures, and also with the hybrid of the miniature board games.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so like the hybridity kind of thing is I'm trying to keep my focus narrow personally, right? And also I just don't do much with board games or like hybrid. There's a real cultural difference which I ran into like a buzzsaw. Like when I talked to the people at Warlord and Mantic and just out and about, they were stunned that I didn't start with historicals, right? So like when I was taking the data like on everybody that I interviewed, there was like this firm age distinction over there about where people started. So in the UK, if you're over the age of like 45, like you 100% started with historicals, right? Flip side to that, it looks a lot like America if you're younger. Like you start with Games Workshop, and then you might move into historicals later. So it's difficult because I think that the history that we are interested in any given country is like very particular to us, right? Like people were stunned that like, you know, I was like, yeah, you know, I kind of like maybe, you know, I play Saga is the main historical game I play, and I'm in a Viking campaign now. And they were stunned that I was doing that, or kind of like flirting with doing like World War II miniatures instead of Napoleonics. Right? You know, like, what do you mean you don't do Napoleonics? I remember John Stallard saying this like almost verbatim. I'd have to check the transcript. Like, what do you mean you don't play Napoleonics? And I was like, we didn't have Napoleon. He's like, I know, and I was just like, you know, there's just no touchstone. So, you know, future casting. I think historicals are really, really cool. The problem is, and it's a similar problem to just Games Workshop kind of gobbling things up in the same way that D&D gobbles up role-playing games, is that I do worry for historicals because, you know, people kind of are, like they're aging. Right? I mean, I don't have any other way to put it, right? Like, you know, young people are not playing historicals. And I think that there's maybe some ways you can do outreach, you know, for that and stuff like that. But a lot of it, at least in the United States, has to do with kind of these direct memories of warfare on your own soil, which we don't have, right? This is something that Chris Beach brought up, right? Where he was like, my dad was in the army, right? And like my granddad was in World War II. Like everybody there was like, you know, bombed in the UK, right? Or like, you know, finding wrecks, you know, German planes in their backyards and stuff like that. So there's this like direct cultural memory that we just don't have here. And I think that's part of the problem with historicals in the United States. So honestly, I don't really know how you change that, unfortunately. It'll always be there. It will.
Hey, and thank you for the talk. I just wanted to ask, does the market reflect the nature of war? Like, have the products that have been offered over time reflect like real war practices? It might be a stupid question. I've been curious. Like, as war becomes more automated, does wargaming tend to reflect that?
Yes and no, right? So like you have a sci-fi game like 40K, you can do whatever you want. You know, you can like future cast your technology, right? And you can say like, yeah, there's like totally automated stuff. There's different levels of complexity, right? There's very simple war games, and then there's very like complicated ones, like Kriegspiel. I've never played it, you know, I've watched it play. My understanding is that like it's enormously complicated, right? So there's always this tension there. Now, something about the complexity of war and like modeling modern conditions. There is some kind of inflection point, and I don't know where it is. I had somebody tell me that like they couldn't play anything that represented the Falklands or later because it was just too close, right? Like it was too immediate. They knew people who were there. The wounds were like fresh, and they didn't want to disrespect people. This is why everybody does like World War II or earlier, right? So there's kind of a question where it's like, no kind of like automated like drone warfare and stuff is not really represented now, but like it can't be because it's too now, I guess. But in 50 years, I bet it will be, right? As those kind of memories of like, you know, drone warfare and wherever it is, you know, Pakistan, like start to fade and it becomes less fresh.
Hey, so in a lot of like, I guess adjacent hobbies like railroads and like historical miniatures that are not for games, there's this, I guess like this impulse towards getting every detail exactly right. Whereas at least historically in my experience in like fantasy wargaming, it's kind of a, you know, make up your own paint scheme, make up your own people and so on. But as the hobby gets introduced more through other mediums like animation or people watching lore YouTube videos and so on before they ever touch their first miniature, do you see that ever changing where more people are like, oh, I want to model this particular Space Marine chapter and get all the details right rather than.
Oh yeah, 100%. And in fact, the local Horus Heresy crew is down front. But like Horus Heresy, right? And Horus Heresy is 10,000 years before Warhammer 40,000, and it is played. The best way I can describe it is a speculative historical game, right? If you play it based on like what's in the novels, right, and you paint, people depending on the group, they get very like, look, that serrated sun unit, they were dead by the time we were playing, blah blah blah, stuff like that. I ignore them. But yeah, and again, this is part of that negotiation, right, which I talk about, that kind of like social negotiation that's always going on, between and amongst miniaturists, which is, what is that group doing, right? Because like every group's a little different, different games are a little different, and some of it is that like you just kind of find your people, right, that kind of think the way that you do, right? I do think that there's worth in kind of resisting the kind of monolithic sort of, I get being like Fidelidus in like a historical game, right? Like, I don't really care if like Games Workshop is, boot is, I'm just not going to like cater to this kind of like, yes, I gotta get the market. Yeah.
Hey, so a lot, it sounds like this might be a little bit outside of the sphere of your focus here, because a lot of your focus is on the lead belt and kind of that central route there. But it struck me, even going back kind of prior to the modern, more sort of pseudo-modern era of wargaming, that like the Kriegspiel that came out of Prussia, I think you said, and that kind of whole history of wargaming you presented is all kind of clustered within kind of the heart of European empire. And it's really informed by that. And I was curious if you knew of any kind of study about the way that wargaming cultures and wargames themselves might be different outside of that sort of imperial sphere. How does being on, I guess, sort of on the other end of that change your attitude to that? Do wargames even arise in the same way because of the different cultural experiences? I just didn't know if you knew if there was any kind of research being done in that kind of
because and I don't know that it's like a lack of desire, but it's the kind of thing, like I said, where it's like not a lot of people study miniature wargames. Like it's kind of weird. It's starting to pick up, and I suspect that kind of study is due to be done, right? It's outside my scope of expertise, right? So I'm not the guy to do it, and like mostly it's like me and my friend Sam and like some Australian folks, and then a bunch of Finnish researchers. And I think that's pretty much it. I'm sorry if it's streaming and anybody's watching and we're doing stuff on it. Like there's stuff in the works. I would love to see that kind of thing. I would, and it will come. It will. I'm quite certain. I know, for instance, that in China there's been a lot of research recently about the role-playing game scene there, because they tend to play like role-playing game cafes, right? I watched this great talk a couple years ago at an analog game studies conference by a researcher, another Shanghai or Hong Kong, I can't remember which, but she was talking about that, right? Taking video and like, showing pictures of it. So I imagine that kind of groundwork where you hit the stuff that's more popular first, like that's what you do. That kind of groundwork can very easily lead to a study of Chinese wargaming, right? Or Chinese wargames that are available, commercially available in the US.
Hi.
Hi.
So in the Q&A section, you mentioned how people you've talked to and your living interviews are squeamish about playing after the Falkland Wars. But you mentioned in the lecture, the massive popularity of games based on World War II, after World War II. Do you have any thoughts on why that sort of transition in the culture has occurred? Is it some, what does that say about how we think about war versus how people thought about it as recently as the 50s?
So let me make sure I got the question right. Like, there's been a transition to playing World War II games, but there's kind of like an invisible limit, and what accounts for
Oh no, it was more and I don't know much about the history of historical wargaming, but it sounded like in the lecture like World War II games were popular like immediately after World War II.
Oh, yes.
And it sounds like that's not the way people think about war games anymore.
I think that some of it is just that, like, we have changed, right? Not like we, like the people in this room, but like we people in general have changed, right? I think that you know, I would get things where, and this is very kind of like typical, and this is immediately recognizable if you have a grandfather who fought in the Korean War or World War II or something like that, or I guess like Vietnam War. You know, we don't talk about the war, right? And I think that, you know, a few people said that there was a recognition that when their fathers or grandfathers or uncles were like playing these World War II games, that it was their way of negotiating their experience in the war, right? And they weren't privy to, like, you know, deep heart-to-heart talks where like their dad started crying and like spilled his guts or anything like that. It wasn't that type, you know, it was like the 50s, 60s, 70s, something like that. But this was how they did it, right? This is how they negotiated that. And we have changed, where like dudes can talk about their feelings more. And that, you know, maybe it's like slightly icky to play something that's only like 20, 30 years ago, right? It's you know, that's the difference, I think. It's just, it's better for us. We're optimistic.
And in context of Warhammer.
I'm going to ask you to speculate.
I love
so you had mentioned that there was like a Europe-centric focus for like the development of original Games Workshop content that became their own. How do you think like I say globalization, but I mean it, and look at how many like white male people are here, right? But how do you think the globalization of that IP, you know, becoming more American, becoming more Eastern, whatever, is going to affect it going into the future, like the whole miniature hobby, right, as we know it? And like with like Henry Cavill, what do you think is going to be like the repercussions of this? Because I think you kind of hinted at like the loss of symbology, maybe a little bit, or maybe it's like a realization it didn't mean anything, maybe. But like, how do you think that'll look in the future?
Well, I certainly think for like Games Workshop, it's already changed. Like, it is just a less weird game than it was even 30 years ago, right? I use this example. There's, if you go back to, I can't remember which article it was, but it was like an early White Dwarf, and they had a scenario, the name's escaping me, but it was about the recent Welsh mine strikes in like 1984 or whenever it was. And the dwarves were the miners, right? And the orcs were the strike breakers. And the orcs, as they were painted up, had a hand-painted banner of Margaret Thatcher. Now, which is really funny. Now, you will never see that in Games Workshop, right? And it's just because, like, you know, it's this confluence of factors, right? So, like, one, you know, that group is like mostly retired, okay. Kind of like weird satire like that is not befitting what their corporate mission is, right? So it just, you know, you smooth things off. The Space Marines, like, okay, maybe they are like kind of the good guys instead of like weird roving fascists, right? And like, you know, that's the obvious touchstone, but I think that that's representative of where they go. I don't think it's ever like gonna completely fade. I don't think that element just gets plucked out entirely and then, you know, it disappears. But I do think that it becomes a situation where it's just, they're not able to do that, right? That doesn't mean that other games can't do that, right? And I suspect, like, let's say that Henry Cavill's like Amazon show where he plays Eisenhorn or whatever it ends up being, is insanely popular, right? It's hard to speculate, but like, generally speaking, when things get mass popular, and I swear I don't mean this in the indie like I was into them before they were popular kind of thing, right? But like, whenever anything hits like some kind of critical mass, it inevitably changes, right? That weirdness gets smoothed away, whatever that weirdness is. And I think that's unfortunate, but I also just think that like that's how things go.
Ian, thanks again for the talk. It was beautiful. Also, you mentioned the loss of empire.
Yeah.
With Games Workshop trying to commercialize and go with that market push gaming, they tried Warhammer Ancients, they tried a couple of other things, trying to get that historical wargaming thing kind of shot the arm in the market, but it never really paid off as much as like the fantasy and sci-fi based stuff. Do you think that that was more of a holdover of that loss of empire post-World War II, new globalization kind of thing?
Well, I think that it's like, so my understanding, and somebody who's in the historical scene in the audience can correct me, because I'm probably garbling part of this. There was something like, as part of the conditions for Rick Priestley and company leaving, they had the rights to use the Warhammer rules or whatever, or text in a Warhammer Ancients kind of thing. I think the reason why it didn't take off is simply, you know, what I was telling that one gentleman, which is like, historicals just don't do well if they weren't as popular, right? My understanding is that it was totally reasonably popular in the UK, right? You know, it wasn't going to set, you know, it wasn't like Bolt Action, which is like a legitimately great game, right? But, you know, it was just, and also I don't think that at that point Warhammer Ancients had like, you know, their own like miniatures factory and things like that. Like, I really like miniatures agnostic games, right? Where you can just play whatever. But also there's something about not being able to plug into like, you know, these are the figures that I play with. It's always going to kind of limit that popularity, right?
With the Black Library, you know, the horror series,
right?
However many decades worth of
right.
that they have now, they have so much canon that they can draw from to create scenario battle play from.
And like and historicals, you can't trademark a Sherman tank, right?
Exactly.
And you can't trademark a Roman soldier, right? You can just buy whatever is the cheapest, or you like this or that sculpt or whatever, right? So it just becomes kind of like, there's this way that like you have to really like understand miniatures in the 21st century, that you have to know what a miniatures game is to be like, I'm gonna go to like 20 websites and like build my Spartan army, right? That's a completely different configuration of like going to the store and like buying miniatures for that specific game. Ross beat me in Necromunda last week.
I did, handily.
No, what?
Two questions about the business of Games Workshop. First, do you think the management style and practices and retail division specifically stems from Brian Ansell's attitudes, for lack of a better word, / behaviors back in the 80s and 90s? Is it just a continuation of that? Or is there something in Games Workshop as a corporation that's rotten as far as management practices?
Spoken like an ex-Games Workshop. We both work retail, but we didn't overlap with the Charlotte story early on. So like, Ansel is this strange figure where everybody I spoke to who knew him, right? So these are all the old school, the oldsters. This is like Stallard and like Priestley and then, you know, some of my anonymous people. They were like, that man was total tyrant, right? It was just, and also, and this is before he died, so this is not, you know, them speaking, you know, don't speak as ill. They all loved him, right? Like, they kind of saw him as like this mad genius, and I don't know how many people like look at like their middle managers and stuff, right? I think it's very much about the kind of like twin events of like first going public, right? Because that immediately changes who you're designing for, what you're designing, et cetera. And then the core homework right then, right? Like that was when marketing trumps game design, right? And by virtue of trumping game design, right? Like it trumps everything else, right? So I think it's that. When I was speaking to Chris Beach, right? Like he was very enthusiastic about speaking about how bad the management at Games Workshop was, and he said that it was basically a pendulum, right? That you had to know when to duck, right? And he had worked there for like 21 years, and he was like, and then you can pop your head up, right? But then the people who like got caught by it are all gone, and hopefully it's some of your managers, and then it swings back, right? And you duck again, and you know, it sounds like an awful place to work.
Okay, second, regarding the Lord of the Rings licensing, when I was at Games Workshop, they secured that license for 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
Within a year or two, they extended it to 10 years. From what I've seen of the sales of that compared to other, and I've not done the research you have, why do they keep continuing that? Is the license really cheap now because it's so far down the line?
My bet, this is only a hunch, this is not based on anything else. My bet is that because they don't want anybody else to get it. It may not make them a lot of money, right? But it could make somebody else a whole lot of money, right? And that's what they're worried about, you know?
Doesn't that seem sort of a contradiction as far as them as a company being more about their IP and being less about, I mean, they're trying to control the ecology, right? The ecosystem around wargaming. You think it's just they see Lord of the Rings as another potential end, so they're just holding it to prevent? Is that what you mean, sort of?
I think it's that, but like let's say Warlord picks up the Lord of the Rings license and like makes a brand new and really, really good, vibrant, modern style war game out of it. And like let's say that that's the thing that catapults Warlord from like kind of like a down here number 2 to like an up here number 2. That's lost sales, right? Like, you know, taken as a totality. That's my hunch. I don't know for certain.
Okay.
The other thing though is that the Lord of the Rings license is really weird and hard to keep track of. There's like the literary license, there's the movie license, and then sometimes they overlap, and there's a license for like the role-playing game, which is separate from the war game, which is separate from a mobile game, you know, et cetera, right? So there may just be some shenanigans where, like you're saying, like the wargaming specific part of that license is incredibly cheap, whereas like a video game license is really expensive.
Cool, thanks.
Be first blood games. FFG would buy it.
If you want to have a conversation at some point about how venture capital thinks about market defense, we could do it, but it's.
I'll sign up for that talk. I want to ask you about 2 events that you mentioned earlier.
Mm-hmm.
One was a bubble due to the pandemic growth, and the other one was an explosion of growth due to a potential TV show or something else. Which do you think will come first?
So the TV show should be read as part of like this potential like COVID era like growth, right? I don't know for certain that the COVID thing is a bubble because we're still in. We don't know whether something's a bubble until it pops, right? Unfortunately. I think that the show's going to come out, and I think it's going to do okay. And that's pretty much as good as it's going to do, right? Like, I do think that there's something kind of like weird and heavy metal about 40K, even in its like non-weird era, that just is not going to have the kind of like mass market television appeal it does in like games and stuff like that, right? That's my guess. I'm quite happy to eat my words when it comes out and becomes Amazon's best, you know, most viewed series ever, right? But I don't think that's it.
Quick question. GW is the World Wrestling Entertainment of the media gaming world.
Oh, so I have thought about that, right? But in a very like particular way, right? How many people watch wrestling? Okay, right, yeah, all right. So there's this way that WWE is constantly pulling from the history of pro wrestling, right? So like it's pulling from its history, it's pulling from the history of like companies that it's bought and stuff like that. But they're very interested in a specific telling of that history and also not getting it accurate in certain ways, right? And I think that Games Workshop's relationship to its own history is very much like pro wrestling's.
Who controls the narrative?
Right, it's like, you know, yeah, it's very true.
I don't think the narrative matters. It gives you something to chat about.
Yeah.
Quick comment about 3D printing and my experience with Games Workshop as a company is just as a hot take. I feel like they do the right thing once they've exhausted every other option. They eventually embrace those. Quick anecdote, I don't know if people are aware, I don't know if this was in the talk earlier, but you know, GW was approached at one point and asked if they would let loose their license IP-wise and produce a video game. There's this little company that wanted to make this game. We really like your fantasy game you have, these orcs and these humans. We want to make a game. And GW said, no, we don't want to diffuse or license stuff yourselves. And this company said, well, we'll go make that game anyway, and we just won't make it yours. And that became what was
Yeah.
so eventually, of course, Games Workshop got into video games and made horrible little ports of mobile games, and some games that were less bad. I'm asking about 3D printing because I feel like the writing is on the wall with the ability to sit in your home and for literally like 1% of the cost make a space marine. I have a feeling Games jumped on this bandwagon, and you know, we'll sell you the models, but we can also sell the files. And these guys that are making really amazing third-party sculpts out there, you know what? We'll let you, you know, we'll claim it, but you can have a fraction of the cost and just all sweep it under their umbrella. And instead of doing that, I think they stamp their feet and pretend like 3D printing's not a thing. And I feel like the cost just is an unavoidable fact. It's just so cheap to do by comparison to buying their product.
Yeah,
They're just gonna have to change something.
There's this real way that 3D printing is an event horizon for the community of wargaming as a hobby, because it's already cheap and widely available. I think that there are a few things that keep that from like being fully realized. So one is that 3D printing is a hobby in and of itself, and it's not one that everybody's interested in, right? I've got a homie who he just left, in fact, but like he bought a 3D printer and you know, bought some stuff, like tried and gave it a go. You know, he has disposable income, so he got a nice one, and he was like, this is not looking the way that I want it to, right? And then he just kind of lost interest, right? So I think that that's an important thing, right? And I think it's probably an understatedly important thing. Right? So I think that that's one thing. Eventually they will, but like the other thing is I don't see too many miniatures gaming companies going whole hog on 3D printing. You know, obviously we have like the 3D sculptors, but like Warlord and Mantic have like some STL files, but they're still heavily invested in like the miniatures and stuff like that. So you know, I think that there's always going to be a place for like just going out and buying miniatures. And by the way, like Games Workshop, like however much like we love it as adults, like it is a game for like 14-year-olds, right? And like a 14-year-old is just not going to get into 3D printing, right? I'll 3D print, you know, some historicals or something like that, but like I'm a 46-year-old man, right? And like 14-year-old again is not whipping out the hot resin, you know, his dad's not letting him.
Do you mind if I provide a little bit of additional answer to respond to you regarding that? So beyond what you said about why doesn't GW go into the digital distribution route, once an SDL, an official SDL goes out, it's going to be wildfire. Talking to somebody from the Eastern Europe, so it's full of fun. Ethics around product consumption, product IPs in the West is completely different from a lot of places in the world.
Yeah.
Most places, I would argue probably the statistical majority of the world will not respect the same ethics and the same values. So if GW ever does that, they cannot control it, which means they just killed their entire buildup of value they've provided over years, immediately.
But like,
That's
even
why
if they
they
do
do
control it, the margins are so much more narrow on digital distribution than they are on selling plastic miniatures.
But also right now, there isn't a good technology to control digital distribution.
Right, but my point is, like, even if they solve that problem, their shareholders
still
don't like it.
If I can interject, because we can have like an extended conversation after all the questions are done. But when I worked in media, like you know, I got plugged into Games Workshop's review cycle, and at some point, and it was like fairly recently, just within like the past few years, like they would send you a physical book to review. Then they were like, oh, people are like taking pictures of like pirating this, right? And that's really bad. So then they started sending me PDFs, and the PDFs, once I started getting, were so overloaded with copyright protection and like DRM and like had my name plastered all over it that like it wasn't just unreadable, it was basically non-functional, right? And I don't have like a bad computer or anything like that. It's like I would scroll and it would take forever to like do the page, and I was like, well, I'm not doing like this is insane. Like why are we doing this? So I think that like this fear of piracy is super big for them, right? It really is. And you know, they're also worried about recasters, right?
You might get a kick out of this as a Horus Heresy player, but when they were doing the playtest rulebooks, and there was external playtesting allowed, they did very similar things as far as like the, I would say, tracking who has what.
Yeah.
But they did it very cleverly by having sentence structures written slightly different. The rules are the
Oh,
same,
that's good,
but
yeah.
they're written slightly different. Or we're going to use this picture on this page for this person's document. Because inevitably, those playtest documents leaked.
Right.
And they know who did it.
Yep.
Basically, we sent this particular copy to this person.
Yeah, because it's
Yep. It was pretty smart.
Yeah, right.
100 different copies of the same document with minor changes.
Yeah. Okay. Josh.
You want to take a question
Oh,
from online
I have
here?
online questions.
Okay, so we've got someone who's joining us from elsewhere. The question is, I think following up on something you said earlier, what tends to cause Anglo-American guys mostly to get into history, wargaming models, etc. at a certain age? So kind of stepping
Okay,
back.
well,
maybe.
okay, so there is, I've got like a dual answer to that, right? One is, it's not a dual answer, it's one linked answer. So this is something that is different in the UK when I spoke to people and when I speak to people over there. They call their miniatures toy soldiers. We've all heard that. I always bristled at that. I was like, these are not toys, these are not toys, right? These are figurines, they're miniatures, right? But what I think that indicates, and there's this really wonderful reading in game studies about, it's a book about boyhood, right? Which is that, and I'm gonna slip into a little bit more academic ease here, but it's about how boyhood is not specifically and forever masculine. It's a trait of being able to play. And we call it boyhood because we link it to masculinity, but it doesn't have to be. And that becomes kind of like the answer to that, right? Is that like we play with toys as men and boys because we can, right? Women can't, right? Or they're not allowed the same affordances to do so. And an affordance towards boyhood as this kind of like, you know, degendered like trait that like everybody should have access to, is an admirable thing to like pursue, right? So I think that it's just bound up in like who gets to play and who gets to play what, and when do they get to play? When do they have to stop playing? Women have to stop playing at about 23, 24. Guys can play until they die, right? And I think that's unfair. But I think that's this basically about it.
Yeah, so I was just curious, as a, I guess, more recent inductee into miniaturing, it seems like there is a lot of animosity towards Games Workshop, even as people are spending a lot of their money on Games Workshop products. So just curious if that was like a more recent change, or if that happened like with the chapter house thing, or how you track that for research.
No, it's been going on for a long time. Certainly since like, I mean, I remember it getting like really pretty rancid in the discourse like around like 2000, between like 2001 and 2005, right? Like, you know, before that everybody, but again, like you point to Gorka Morka, like 1997, and there's a shift there and everything like that. And I think the more interesting question is, why not, and I know that some of the answer is because we're all just primed to just go for like the big brand dominant thing, Dungeons and Dragons and World of Warcraft and Warhammer, right? But like, just play something else. Like, do you know how many like awesome games, particularly at the skirmish level, are out there? I was telling Larkin about this new game by a couple YouTubers who put out a couple games already. So I know it's probably called Death Wizards, and it's like you play different styles of necromancer and like a dungeon keeper skirmish game where you're fighting each other, but you're also fighting villagers. And it's miniatures agnostic, but they partnered with like a 3D sculptor who makes some really awesome like Boondark prints. Like, I'm incredibly stoked to play this game, right? Now the problem is like I can't go down to the store and be like, but like that is part of the capture as I get that like finger point, which is like you play the thing where you have to have other people, right? It just becomes a self-perpetuating cycle. But I agree that like Games Workshop discourse is miserable, right? Like if you want Games Workshop games, if you want Warhammer to be a game that it is not, you are going to be perpetually disappointed, right? They are very specific kind of games with like really fancy miniatures. That's what they do, right? They want to push those fancy miniatures. And if you play them for that, they're awesome. And if you play for any other reason, right, particularly competitive play, right, then you are going to be hugely bummed out, and you're better off playing like a different game.
Roll up.
just maybe to add some comments on the toxicity of it. So yeah, I think it's a fantastic case study on codependency with wargamers, like maybe some of the PhDs in psychiatry on that. But I've been playing since the mid-90s, and I think your Gorka Morka event, that was good context. I wasn't aware of that. I had a copy of it. But yeah, I remember the guys in my gaming group getting particularly frustrated with GW when 3rd edition 40K came out. Because the delta there was, if you look at the flagship games of Fantasy and 40K, they were mostly in expansion mode. Like every edition essentially made the game bigger, but it didn't obsolesce any of the rules or really change them. And Rogue Trader was kind of a unique case. But once you got to 3rd edition 40K, that was the first time in over a decade that GW had made a massive change to the rules and reset them. And that's when I started to see, quote, a lot of frustration with GW and play balance. So I think to your comment, I think a lot of that comes from the being more market focused and market centric. I think some of that's endemic to the player base. I mean, video games have a so toxic it makes the news, right? So there's still just an endemic part of that. But the griping there, I think, comes from a change in how they operate their business model, which I think started to creep up in the late 90s.
Yeah, so if you're interested in that Gorka Morka thing, are you familiar with the website Goonhammer?
Yeah.
The website called Goonhammer, it's really good. They do commentary on rules and also like history. They do a 2-part piece on the release of Gorka Morka. They interview Andy Chambers, a lot of other people, and like they lay out the history there. And that's basically my source on this, because like they're remarkably thorough in this piece, and it's well worth a read, because that is one of those pivotal events there that changes how like they design games, right? You never design games the same way after Gorka Morka comes out and like fails.
I was just going to highlight on the supply chain and availability issues that have driven a lot of frustration from the mid-90s to today, including in the early 2000s when it was really bad. The switch they did in 2015, 2016 to milk whales, I thought might kill the company, and I was very wrong. It's been the most profitable thing they've ever done, but availability is even worse than it's ever been.
Yeah, now that is part of, like the way global supply chains operate now in general, right? Anybody who's ever worked in like warehousing and logistics knows that like we operate in like a just-in-time model, where you do not keep excess stock. Like you have what you need, the bare minimum that you need, so that we can cut down on your warehouse spaces. Because what's really expensive is having stock that doesn't sell and stuff like that. And they really, really, really took that to heart. One of the things in that Gorka Morka piece, right, is that one of the lessons is like they took 2 lessons from Gorka Morka besides the design ones, right? One, they were never going to have backstock again, right? They were never going to have backstock again. 2, they were never going to get into debt, and they still have not taken out like major loans. They're like one of the only companies like that size, and certainly of that stature, given like the market that they operate in. Their debt is like small to like non-existent, and it has been for like ages.
Not even for tax reasons, no debt.
I would have to like get deeper into the books, but like functionally no. Like they don't operate with the debt.
They on average carry less debt than they carry cash.
Yes. Yeah, that's a better way to put it.
So from talking to guys at headquarters like a decade ago, they were waiting to sell everything they built before they did another production run, which is why a third of their inventory is out all the time.
Yeah.
And it's not to create the illusion of scarcity. They literally just are waiting for cash.
Yeah, and it's not going to change. Like it will never change. They're never going to like buy another factory to like produce more. They're never going to. They might do that, right? But like they're never going to like buy more warehouse space. That will never happen. Never.
So you've talked a little bit about sort of audience capture by Games Workshop, and I think there's a network effect there, and that if I go into a store and I'm looking for a game, I can find a game of 40K and I gotta fight for other things.
Yeah.
But I wonder to what extent there's also some effect that one of the things that Games Workshop seems to be really good at is both doing really great sculpts, but also like splitting models up onto sprues so that when you assemble them, you hate it, let's say, a little bit less than you do with their competitors, and you don't see the mold lines when you're done. Like, how big a deal is that for their popularity?
So there's like a subjective thing there, right? Because I know people who still are like, no, like give me like a discrete head and like some discrete arms because I like building my own dudes, right? And you know, now I think as Ross put it was, you know, if you want to convert a guy now, like you have to build them in full and then chop them up rather than just take them. So I think there's something subjective there, but the way that they chop up their miniatures is really fascinating, right? So I think there is something to that, that like when you get it as a whole, like it is, you know the mold lines are fewer. You know, you do weird things with like elegant plastic that like I don't see anybody else doing. You know, a Nighthawk ghost on like a little spindly thing that for some reason doesn't break, right? You know, as long as you're like reasonably careful. So they do some fascinating things. I asked, so like I talked to one person who, because my theory has always been that the reason why they set up their sprues in such a complicated arrangement now is to get ahead of Chinese recasters in particular, because they can't, like, it's really hard to like recast a sprue if there's like, you know, the famous Goliath cigar that's like this big and like you can't even see it on the sprue. But this guy was like, no, that's not the case. So like what it is like it's, you know, it's just for maximizing or I guess minimizing shipping costs. Right? I was like, okay. But like you guys do it with like an algorithm or something like that, right? And he was like, no. And I was like, how do you do it? And they were like, yeah, there's this guy named like Gary or something like that. and he just like no lie, he looks at a miniature and you look at like a master sculpt for like 30 seconds and he's just like, yeah, okay, so we're gonna do this, this, and this, and this. And I was like, there's like one guy? He's like, yeah, and he's been here for like 40 years. And it's like, that's like the craziest thing I've ever heard. Like, I want to talk to that guy, and of course, like, you can't talk to anybody in the shop, right? Like, Lord knows I tried, but yeah, it's just Gary, like, sitting back there, like, eyeballing it and like, just being like, put that on there, you know? That's so neat. I love that.
I have a question, actually.
Okay.
So in a lot of 40K art from the early days, you see a lot of different Space Marine chapters represented. There's like a lot of Blood Angels, Black Templars, Crimson Fists, all of that. Can you talk a little bit about how Games Workshop decided to make Ultramarines like the only boys that you really see on the boxes? They're just the default dudes.
I don't know. Like honestly, they had some kind of internal conversation that we're not privy to that had something to do with color aesthetics and like naming conventions and stuff like that. Like, I don't know. I'd love to have have an answer, but everybody has their poster boy. It's like how in Age of Sigmar they had that exact same conversation about how, you know, Stormcast, which are going to be in every box, were going to be like golden blue, right? Like that's what it was. Which weirdly like makes me think that like maybe there's something about blue. Which is like, yeah.
I can answer that question.
Okay. Somebody has an answer.
The reason, one of the reasons, first of all, Ultramarine is a very distinct conjunction of two words that is very easily recognized. That's number one, so it's marketing. Second, regarding to the color is in the second edition that prototype role, remember that's where that kind of started afterward, right? Because there was that Black Templar. That particular shade of yellow and that with the conjunction of those blues that they use on the cover art is almost the maximum hue contrast you can get. Meaning it's exactly copying. Now, also the genius marketing thing that they did with that is Ultramarines became all the generic Marine armies you can employ. So now here's the core rules for this. This is your visual capture, but here's here's the realm that you can explore and create your own chapter space using this framework. That's why.
Yeah, and blue and gold would be around that same contrast point.
Yeah. It's the same number.
Yeah.
It's the same number.
Yeah. Makes perfect sense. All right, we're good. Cool.
Ian, you got
you
want to take one more from the stream here?
I'll take one more from the YouTubes.
All right. So the question is, the lore and setting of 40K recently seem to be easily co-opted by the alt-right and fascist groups, and GW seems particularly ill-suited to combat them. How do you see the community reacting?
Well, I don't. I mean, I've not particularly seen any community in like any kind of transmedia like corporation react to like the rise of, you know, any strain of far right politics. You know, that's I was optimistic earlier, but now I'm like being depressing. But like you know the thing is that I do, however, mean what I say, right? Which is that like these things are under contestation, right? And that Warhammer, right, like writ large, but particularly 40K, is many different things at once. And some of them are really like interesting and like have kind of a progressive bent to them, and some of them don't, right? And so at least within the community, it depends on like how you negotiate what you want to emphasize, right? So that's up to the community to decide, because I agree, like Games Workshop is not right. Now, Games Workshop, to their credit, right? What was it? Was it last summer they did the thing where like that guy at a tournament in Spain showed up in a full-fledged Nazi uniform, and they were like, no, you're getting out, and you're banned for life, and like we're gonna put out a public statement that this kind of thing isn't acceptable, right? Now, it was parsed in like, you know, kind of like corporatese, right? We're not talking about like, you know, Games Workshop is not the vanguard of the revolution, I'm sorry to say. But as corporate like statements go, it was firm and it was not bad, right? So I think it's okay to give Games Workshop maybe a little more credit, right? You know, I suppose that they could make that kind of, you know, the kind of like old style satire like more pointed and more obvious, right? But I'm not really into literalist readings of media, and I don't think that that's like, it's certainly better than like, you know, a bunch of fascists running around. But like, I don't think that that's exactly what we want either, right? So I don't really have the answer. I give Games Workshop a little more credit. I don't know that the community's going to do much, but like, you know, this goes back to the thing that I've said in my talk over and over and over again when I've been presented with a question like that. Find your people, right? There are a lot of people playing war games, and there are a lot of different war games, right? You don't have to play Warhammer, right? That's one. If you do play Warhammer, there are plenty of like people who share your politics, or like, barring that, right? Like they just share what they're interested in, the same 40K that you're interested in. But you gotta find them, right? And that can be work sometimes. That's it.
Cool. Thank you all for coming out. Also, we made it through almost 2 hours of Warhammer discourse, and nobody complained about custodies. So pat yourself on the back.
It's too late now, but I have my answer game down there.
I get going at one discourse myself.